This episode is also made possible by our Patreon supporters: Kim Hokinson, Julie Gray, Janelise Cannon, Heather McKinnon, Jamie Lang, Maria Carla Sanchez, Valerie Jacobson, Jill Harrigan, Chantel Oliver, Michaela Frew, Amanda Gilmore, Lindsay Cummings, and Valerie LaPointe Loon. We're so grateful for our patrons. We couldn't make the podcast without you. Hi, Katie.
Hi, Olivia.
We are in New York City. It is 1902. We're at a performance of the celebrated German circus family, the Brumbachs.
Yes, please.
And on stage is a young woman named Katharina Brumbach.
Okay.
More familiarly known as Katie.
Good name, obviously.
And she is demonstrating her feats of strength.
Oh, cool.
Because she is, in the parlance of the time, a strongman.
Great.
She has already completely wowed the crowd. She is juggling cannonballs. She is lifting massive heavy weights over her head. She is lifting her husband over her head with one hand.
Fabulous.
And sort of bouncing him around on her arm. The crowd is fully with her.
Yes. Oh, good. So am I.
She ends her contest in the way she always has, which is by calling up anyone from the audience who would like to come and see if they can lift more than she can.
Okay.
What Katie perhaps did not realize is that in the audience is Eugen Sandow, the most famous strongman in the world.
Oh.
Here's her husband's account of what happened.
Okay.
Once during a United States tour, we were in New York when Sandow entered. As he watched Katie work with the barbells, an amused look crossed his face. Katie, annoyed, said to him, "Perhaps you would like to try it?" Sandow came up and began to lift each of the weights as Katie put them on. They grew heavier and heavier. Finally, Katie hefted a 300-pound bell, pulled it higher, and then pushed it over her head. Now all eyes turned to Sandow. He braced himself, he strained. He could bring the bell to his chest, but he could raise it no higher. At last he lowered it to the ground, defeated. "Young woman," he said, "you are very strong indeed. Thank you for the contest." And with that, he left.
Hooray! Is that for real?
That's for real.
It's not a scam, is it?
It really happened.
Oh! That's wonderful.
Katharina Brumbach was one of the first true celebrity strongwomen. And up until this moment, she had been known mostly as the Lady Hercules.
Cool.
After this contest with the great Sandow, she acquired her new nickname, which she would use for most of her life, the Great Sandwina. As in, she who defeated Sandow.
Wow. This is great. I've never heard of the Great Sandwina, and I'm already mad about it.
This whole story is a series of, please tell me that happened. And the answer is yes. I'm Olivia Meikle.
And I'm Katie Nelson.
And this is What's Her Name?
Fascinating women you've never heard of.
I had also never heard of the Great Sandwina until I got a copy of this truly amazing book called Strong Like Her.
Yes.
It is a wonderful book. It dives so much deeper into the history and the whys and the hows and the so whats of women's athletic history. It brings up and answers questions that I never even thought to ask.
Cool. The author of this book has made me care deeply about this subject. Her name is Haley Shapley, and I'm so excited that she's going to introduce us to the great Sandwina.
My name is Haley Shapley. I'm a journalist and the author of Strong Like Her, a celebration of rule breakers, history makers, and unstoppable athletes. And it is a cultural history about women and physical strength that starts in ancient times and goes all the way through modern day, looking at how our ideas about muscularity and femininity have changed over time, and some of the trailblazers along the way who've made it possible for women to work out for recreational purposes today. I found Katie Sandwina through research for the book. I was looking for who the trailblazers were in strength training specifically, and you really can't look into strength training history without running into Katie Sandwina. She is definitely one of the strongest women in the world. There were a lot of circus performers who gained acclaim for their feats of strength, but none captivated people quite as much as Sandwina did.
Katharina Brumbach was one of 14 or 13 or maybe 15 children. Okay. Born to sixth-generation circus performers, Philippe and Johanna Brumbach. Wow. A circus family to the bone. Wow. Legend says she was born in the back of a circus wagon just outside of Vienna. Okay. Records say she was born in Essen, Germany. But I would say that any good circus star worth her salt simply has to be born in the back of a circus wagon.
There's a lot of lore and myth that goes into circuses. So when they were creating these backstories, there was a little liberty taken with some of the details on those. Katie Sandwina was born Katharina Brumbach in 1884 to a family of circus performers. Her parents were both incredibly strong. Her dad was 6'6" and apparently had fingers so large that his wedding ring was bigger than $50. And her mom had 15-inch biceps, which is a very respectable circumference for a bicep muscle. So Katie was always destined to be strong, and she really took that natural talent and ran with it.
Katie began being incorporated into her parents' act at 2 years old. And by the time she was a teenager, Katie's father would offer 100 German marks to any man in the audience who could defeat her in wrestling. She's 13, 14 years old. Okay. No one ever succeeded in beating her. But it was during one such performance that Katie met her husband of 42 years, Max Heyman. Aww.
We should first start by talking about their meet cute. When she was wrestling, Max was one of the men who threw his hat in the ring, and he was quickly trounced by Sandwina.
His account of that meeting is amazing.
I chanced upon the act in a little town in Saxony in 1900. I was not nearly so intrigued by Katie as by the chance to make some money. I was 19, an unemployed acrobat, and very much down on my luck. I barely saw my opponent. I was too busy counting out the prize money in my mind. As I stepped into the ring, all I could think of was this would be the easiest 100 marks a man ever made. The next thing I knew, I was spinning high in the air. The blue sky above me seemed to be coming closer. Then, with a sudden swoop, I was flat on my back, gasping for breath and consciousness. The girl was bending over me. I alone could hear her worried whisper, "Are you hurt?"
Wow. Aww. Max fell head over heels, literally, in love. The next day, Max joined the Brumbach family circus. Aww. Katie was 16, Max was 19, 2 years later, they were married,
Aww.
and Max spent the rest of his life as her biggest cheerleader, supporter, and literal sidekick. Soon after their marriage, the Brumac family traveled to America to tour with the circus. And when she was performing in New York City, the incident with Eugen Sandow takes place.
Awesome.
Eugene was considered the most popular bodybuilder of his day. He had perfect proportions, chiseled abs. He could wrestle a lion. He was just a very well-known, widely admired guy. And they ended up going toe-to-toe in a lifting throwdown.
She is not famous at this point. She's, a regular traveling circus act.
And she's pretty young at that point, then.
She's still very young. She's 19, 20.
Oh my gosh.
And she has just defeated the most famous strongman in the world.
Amazing.
And Katie certainly made the most of it, renaming herself the Great Sandwina to proclaim her victory in every town. She starts touring with larger circuses and soon became a headliner at the big show, the Barnum and Bailey Circus.
Oh, dang.
She performed with them for decades until she was nearly 60 years old.
What? Wow.
She was not a small person. Accounts vary, but she was somewhere around 6 feet tall. And for most of her career, she weighed around 200 pounds. So she was a little bit bigger, I guess, than most of the women at the time. They typically weren't that tall.
Her biceps and calves were said to measure 17 inches each around.
Wow.
Katie, could you measure your bicep for me?
Okay. I think this is our great-grandma's measuring tape, FYI.
Huh?
That I happen to have here. Okay, how many inches was her bicep?
17.
17. Okay. I'll flex, so I'll be as impressive as I can. At my strongest point, we've got 11 inches. Okay, so
another 6 inches of solid muscle.
Wow. And they didn't have steroids back then either, so she's just genuinely muscle.
So she was undeniably incredibly strong, stronger than any woman on record at the time. And her specialty was that overhead lift. Her overhead press was a record for decades. It took a very long time for anyone to beat that.
She won a tug-of-war with 4 horses.
Aw, cool. She's so cool.
She would juggle 30-pound cannonballs.
Wow.
Of course, her most famous was lifting her husband over her head with one hand.
Amazing.
And that's funny, right? That's a great bit.
Totally.
You're lifting your husband.
Your husband, yeah. That's what makes it so delightful.
Yeah, I think it adds to the humor and the charm. But I think it also serves a very important purpose of making it clear to the audience, this very Victorian turn-of-the-century audience, that he's okay with his wife doing this. That it's all right
to have a strong woman.
Yes, that he is not emasculated or upset, and therefore you, audience, don't need to be either. It's okay.
Way to go, Max. What a guy.
Of course, we don't know everything about their relationship, but from all accounts that it was a loving relationship where he really did admire her, and he didn't have an issue with the fact that she was stronger or more famous than he was. He didn't seem to ever stifle that or want to tear her down, and I think that is a great example of a couple that was, living feminist beliefs before that was a thing. So, yeah, I think Max was a huge part of Sandwina getting to be who she was. That's actually a theme in my book with a lot of the women who were successful. often did have supportive partners, which I think just shows how important it is to have supportive people in your life, to have someone who backs you. And we see this pattern play out a lot.
A famous reporter named Marguerite Martin wrote extensively about the Great Sandwina when her circus came to St. Louis, Missouri in 1911.
Gee, wouldn't I love to be able to bat a man around like that? This sentiment came from a woman behind me as I sat watching the middle ring at the circus. The inspiration of that inelegant remark was the act of Frau Sandwina, who at that moment was twirling her husband about in dizzy circles above her head. She tosses him about as though he were not flesh and bone, but merely an effigy of inflated rubber. And he is no insignificant husband either.
When I think about it, those are my actual thoughts too. Like, I love her and I envy her. Gee, wouldn't I love to be able to just pick somebody up and toss them around? Like, I guess that's what cartoons serve us too. It's like imagining super strength.
Yeah. Yeah, she is not just strong. She is quite literally the strongest woman in the world.
Awesome.
And she retains that title for over 80 years.
Amazing.
Her official record for an overhead lift, which she did in 1906. That record stood until 1987.
Wow.
When it was defeated by weightlifter Karen Marshall.
Wow.
The way she is marketed and described, and the way she markets and describes herself, is fascinating. Her first tour in the US, she toured as Europe's Queen of Strength and Beauty.
Lovely.
I think the way that Sandwina was marketed does tell us something about what it took for strength to be acceptable for women. One of the big ways she was marketed was as strong as Hercules, but as beautiful as Venus. And that juxtaposition is really at the heart of who Sandwina was.
So I'm going to have you look at a picture of Katie Sandwina.
Okay.
Because I promise you, she doesn't look anything like what you are picturing.
Oh, interesting. Wow. I expected her to look more giant.
Yeah, she looks
regular.
like
regular. Yeah, she looks regular.
She is not visibly muscly.
It's not like I was expecting something like, oh, there's a genetic thing going on and this is a giant person.
I kind of compare it in the book to it being like a hidden talent where you would look at her and you wouldn't necessarily know that she was so strong because she didn't have that visible muscle the way that Eugen Sandow did, for instance. I mean, you look at that man, he's chiseled out of marble. You look at Sandwina and she just looks like a very beautiful woman. So I think that juxtaposition when people looked at her and then saw what she could do, that was really fascinating to people because she kind of had this every woman exterior, but behind that was this incredible talent. She was considered to have the perfect proportions, and her beauty was always emphasized. She didn't have the hard lines that can sometimes come with muscles. She wasn't trying to reduce her body fat in order for her muscles to pop the way a bodybuilder today would. She wasn't going for any kind of striations in her muscles. And that was more palatable for people. That was more feminine for them. And although she was, of course, very strong, you would never see her flexing. She was often described as very graceful, and the way that she moved was considered very pleasing. She had a real elegance to the way that she moved. And that is why she was able to be such a success. One of the ways that they marketed Sandwina was by having a big group of doctors come in and take her measurements.
And then the doctors would announce that she was the perfect specimen of a woman.
Interesting.
She had the perfect proportions.
So that got people to come out because they were like, we got to see the perfect woman.
And she's Like this in the Victorian era when everybody is trying to cinch their waist to the smallest bit possible and there's doctors saying she's the perfect. I love that so much.
And it's fascinating because there is very much, right, corseting and be as small as possible, but there is also, at this point, a push for health.
Yeah.
That one of the beauty ideal options is to be sturdy in a very specific way. It's sort of the Victorian ideal don't die in childbirth edition.
Although her frame might be considered bigger than desirable by mainstream standards today, a grand stature, a sturdy build, a robust constitution, those were some of the components of one of the beauty ideals that they had. So I think she did fit into that a bit. Of course, it did not include as much muscularity as she had, so I think she really pushed the envelope on that, which was great in showing women that they could look a different way and still be considered attractive. But it did sort of fit into something that they already had. There were also some really interesting quotes about her at the time. I loved reading all the newspaper articles about her because the way that journalism back then was just very flowery and lots of detail often about things that seemed minute. But she had an influential journalist named Kate Carew who spent some time with her. And Kate really interviewed only the most famous people. So this was a pretty big deal that she wrote about Sandwina. And one of the things Kate said was her arms, which can raise 240 pounds above her head, are supple and smooth enough to project from a ball gown. No horrid lumps of muscle, dears, just a little ripple under the skin. Like mice playing in a mattress.
That's a positive, apparently.
Yeah. Pick a different metaphor, but it's true. No lumps.
Again, it just goes back to this idea that it's a hint. It's a little hint of muscle. It looks good in a ball gown. She's still pretty. She can still wear silk. And another journalist, Marguerite Martin, said similar things about her. She talked about her slender, silk-encased limbs and her perfect womanly proportions, and how she was more like a new and shining statue of a heroic Venus rather than the antique and gnarled god of strength. We see a lot of the other strong women of the time kind of marketed as freaks. They're marketed as other, as something that you would gawk at, but that you might not necessarily want to emulate. But Sandwina was always marketed as very beautiful, as very feminine, even as dainty despite her size, to be someone who was admired instead of gawked at. She had a beautiful face by conventional societal standards, and that matters. That helps. But I think she was also very shrewd, and she knew that talking about being a mother, talking about being a wife, not flexing in her photos, that this would be important to gaining acceptability among a mainstream crowd. And that balancing act is really where her popularity comes from.
And all the other strong women of this time are mostly named after Greek or Roman goddesses.
Okay.
There's Minerva, there's Vulcana, there's Athleta.
The bodybuilding community in general, that was very much where they took all their inspiration from at the time.
Makes sense. Like the Greek revival that started the Olympics and all.
Yeah, and Eugen Sandow himself is mostly credited with starting this sort of revival of ancient Greece in bodybuilding. He did it very deliberately. He decided that he wanted to have the perfect body, so he went out and looked at all the ancient Greek statues he could find, decided that that was the perfect ideal male body, and deliberately set out to sculpt his body to match those statues.
The statue. Cool.
The exact same proportions, the measurements. Oh, I am a third of an inch smaller in my chest than that one, so I will work on that. And he did. It's kind of amazing. When you look at him, he looks like a Greek statue, which immediately makes you realize how different bodybuilding has become.
Oh.
Because looking like a Greek statue is not the goal anymore.
Yeah.
And he certainly would not have any chance in any current bodybuilding competition. But he's the first one who sets this norm of bodybuilder equals ancient Greece. And so all the strong women are also doing that. They're either an ancient Greek or Roman goddess, or they are the feminized version of a famous male strongman, Sandwina, showing that you have defeated that strongman.
I'm waiting for that Greek goddess ideal to come back, because that's kind of like what I'm naturally like. So, if that comes back into vogue, that's perfect for me. But if it does, it'll be in style for like 3 years at max, I talk about this a lot, how quickly body standards shift. We tend to have relatively fixed ideas about a conventionally beautiful face. And if you transported yourself to the 1600s or to ancient Greece, you would probably be able to pick out who the majority of the crowd thinks is attractive from a facial perspective. But you would not be able to pick that out from a body type perspective, because it wildly swings. And there are a lot of factors that go into it. One of them is, how hard is this to achieve? In times of famine, then you want to be plump. And in times of plenty, you want to be thin. There's a bunch of other factors that go into it as well. And so it's just highly variable. So it's not something worth chasing, because you're never going to fit the ideal for more than a small amount of time. It'll change.
If you have the perfect body type for the time period you are living in, fantastic for you. You've got maybe 4 years before that changes.
One thing I love about Sandwina is that she embraced taking up space. She would puff up her hair and wear heels, even though she was already tall. She did not mind being perceived as even bigger than she was. I grew up playing basketball, and I'm not a tall person, unfortunately, because it really does come in handy when you're a basketball player. But I, of course, did play with a lot of tall girls, and many of them wanted to downplay their height. They felt uncomfortable with towering over boys or standing out in a crowd. They'd hunch their shoulders. They wouldn't wear heels. They would do whatever it took to appear smaller. And I love that Sandwina did not seem to have any of those hang-ups. She was unapologetically taking up space. And I think that is something that appealed to the audience that came to see her.
So let's talk about the circus.
Okay.
The circus was, and still is, I would argue, so much more important than I think most people ever think about or understand.
We don't really understand the impact of the circus today because, for one, we don't really have circuses anymore. Maybe some people grew up with kind of the last remnants of a circus, but when the circus came to town, everything shut down. You took off work, you stopped what you were doing, you all went to the circus because there were not other forms of entertainment. There was no TV. There was obviously no internet. There wasn't even radio at the time. So this is how people entertained themselves. And the circuses would compete against each other. So they were always striving to be the best, the biggest, the most popular circus. And to do that, they really had to pull out all the stops.
It's like your window to the world and the range of ways of being that your society didn't tell you even existed.
Yes. So Haley Shapley calls it a funhouse mirror to society, which I love. It is
That's great.
forcing you to look at things differently, forcing you to see things as funny and odd and warped.
Shrinking this part and expanding this part.
Yes. And therefore making you think about what things normally look like. That we don't notice what things look like until we see them from outside, right? And the circus is a place where the rules that you have lived your life believing are not always true. Biology is not what you thought it was. People are different sizes. People do things you didn't know human bodies could do. Animals that you never knew existed suddenly exist sometimes. And it proves to these audiences, these very rural, isolated audiences, that some tropes are false. That women are not always blank.
Yeah.
And if they're not always blank, then they're not that.
Yeah.
If it's not always true, then it's not true. The circus is filled with women who are already subverting and living their lives completely free of social expectations and norms. They're doing that physically, strong women, the bearded lady, the tattooed lady.
Yeah.
And socially. They're earning their own money. They're financially and physically independent of men.
And they're just traveling
they're moving around the world.
Yes.
They are overtly refusing the angel in the home rhetoric.
Yeah.
It's a complete rejection of all of the things that these audiences have been taught to expect as normal and universal ways of being.
No wonder that running away to join the circus became such a common trope, if not dream. You know, well, if you don't like it here, what are you going to do? Run away to join the circus? That's the alternate world.
Yeah.
To whatever you've been served.
Yeah, and I hadn't thought about what an important force it is for not normalizing, because it's doing the opposite of normalizing, but acquainting people with the other.
Showing what's possible.
Yeah.
I wanted to share one quote from Kate Carew that I really like about Sandwina. She says, "In her presence, you can think of nothing small, only of large things like nature, motherhood, and creation. She is as majestic as the Sphinx, as pretty as a Valentine, as sentimental as a German schoolgirl, and as wholesome as a great big slice of bread and butter."
Wow, what a reporter.
I know. Now I want to do an episode on her because this writing is incredible.
Amazing.
And I just think that is a lovely way to be described, actually. And I love that Sandwina does inspire these thoughts of things that are bigger than ourselves. And that she taps into that just by being someone who does take up space and is unapologetic about how strong she is.
Think about what reading that does for women who have always felt wrong. They're too big, they're too tall, they're too muscly, they're too whatever. And suddenly, their body type is being equated with nature, motherhood, and creation.
Yeah. She could have laughed at the circus freak, but instead she elevates it.
She fangirled hard over Katie Sandwina. It's wonderful. And of course, it's nearly impossible to unpack what people really thought about stuff versus what they said about stuff, especially when your whole life depends on marketing yourself a certain way.
For sure.
But it seems like Katie really did love family life, domesticity as much as one can domesticize in a wagon. She and Max had 2 children. Pregnancy did not slow her down. She performed 2 shows the night before her first child was born.
Wow.
Which I
That'll get the labor going.
She's lifting her husband over her head 12 hours before she gives birth.
Amazing.
She named her son Teddy Roosevelt. This German circus performer named her son Teddy Roosevelt.
Amazing.
And remarked to the press that her newborn was so little. He was only 10 pounds. He would grow up to become a championship heavyweight boxer in the 1920s.
Wow. Okay.
His mom was his sparring partner, much to the delight of the press.
Of course. Oof.
Some amazing pictures there.
Wow.
Second son, Alfred, became an actor. And she seems to have genuinely loved motherhood.
She liked to cook. She was very cheerful about her household responsibilities. She enjoyed domestic responsibilities, or at least that's what she portrayed to the media. She really liked to eat healthy. She liked to emphasize taking care of your health through nutrition. She believed that she wasn't special. She believed that anyone, if they trained and fueled their bodies properly, could go on to do great feats of strength.
There were lots of stories and newspaper articles written about her mothering, her cooking, her domestic life.
Fascinating.
She's an angel in the home in a circus wagon on the road.
Love it. So do we find out what her diet was and stuff like that? Like, what
Yes,
is there
and
secret,
she
like
was-
Bavarian sausages or?
No, she was very adamant about health, about nutrition, and she was adamant that she was not special. She insisted that anyone who trained and took care of their body the way she did could do what she did.
I am not a freak of nature. Instead, I just love the most natural life.
Wow.
Now, I will just go out on a limb and say, no matter how much nutrition and training, I will never lift 300 pounds over my head. But
Not with an attitude like
not
that.
with an attitude like that. But
She said you could.
I could do significantly better than I
okay.
am. What nutrition meant in 1902, of course, was quite different than
Sure.
what we understand it to be. But her menu sounds pretty good. Here's Katie Sandwina's recipe for health and strength and raising healthy and strong children.
Okay.
Eat much good food, plenty vegetables, plenty fruit, not so much meat except when it is boiled with vegetables. I use always butter instead of lard or oil, and I cook everything a long time. We eat a great deal when we are hungry, and when you are always outdoors or doing much exercise, you get very hungry. Then, when we become tired, we sleep, much more soundly than other people. And these things make us strong.
Oh my gosh. Well, that sounds fresh and different.
I mean,
Slow cook, lots of vegetables.
fruit, butter, little bit of meat.
Fascinating.
That is my diet, actually. So why am I not lifting 300 pounds over my head?
You're only missing the weightlifting. Just try it.
And her doing this domestic front obviously makes her palatable to audiences, right? She looks like this specific
Yeah.
Victorian ideal. But she's doing all of that as a circus performer who's on the road from city to city every night. I mean, that has to be subversive of these norms, even if nobody is noticing or acknowledging that. Accepting that this is an acceptable
Yeah.
version of a Victorian woman throws everything into disarray. Just the implicit social impact of her unabashedly being who she was
Yeah.
has to have been enormous. But she was also explicitly and very loudly doing advocacy and pushing for change. This is the age of the new woman, which is a rejection of everything the Victorian and patriarchal narrative says women should be. They're pushing back against that control. They're pushing for more freedom, independence, self-direction.
Jobs.
They're getting
Yeah.
jobs. They are delaying or even refusing marriage. They're smoking cigarettes.
They're cycling around the world or pretending to.
And they are demanding the vote. Katie Sandwina becomes an incredibly influential suffragette. She has this huge platform, and she uses it explicitly and implicitly. And kind of single-handedly destroys one of the first big arguments that the anti-suffrage crowd was using.
Back in the early 1900s, one of the common arguments that people used against women having the right to vote was that women could not physically defend the country if pressed in war. And when journalists visited with Sandwina, they started to realize it's not true. Sandwina would be an excellent person to take into physical battle.
5 minutes of watching Sandwina on a stage blows that argument to smithereens.
Especially because she says, I'm not unique.
I am the every woman if they just
Trained
took
with some weights.
better care of themselves. And if this woman could defend the country in a war, then the argument is invalid. If some women could defend the country in war, should those women be allowed to vote? What about men who can't join the army? Should they not be allowed to vote? Instantly, the argument is much more complicated and messy. And very quickly after a newspaper reporter points this problem out, that argument goes by the wayside.
Wise.
If physical strength is to decide supremacy in this government, why then, here was Sandwina, displaying more strength than the average man, be he voter or otherwise. Wouldn't it be a good idea to nominate the young Amazon and follow her to victory?
So Sandwina ended up becoming the vice president of Barnum and Bailey's suffrage group, which had 800 members. This was in 1912, and so people started referring to her as Sandwina the suffragette.
Wow.
800 circus women suffragists.
And some people thought that this was yet another kind of marketing tactic or a way to get publicity for the circus. But whatever the reason that Sandwina became involved or that the suffrage group formed in general, it became clear that the women of the circus actually had a lot of influence. They had a lot more power than the typical woman at the time because they made their own money. They traveled. They went to places far from home. And they had this measure of influence that women in a more typical walk of life just didn't have. They had access to meeting people from all different places and with different viewpoints. And so the circus women actually became quite influential in the movement for suffrage. And people kind of felt like, look, if these women are making their own money and doing their own thing, why can't we have some of that independence too? So a lot of the athletes of the time did make a difference in spreading the message and convincing the general population that this made sense for women to also have the right to vote.
Audiences who would never hear this stuff anywhere else.
That's what I was
who
thinking.
Would never attend a suffragist rally.
They're reaching the rural folks who are coming for the elephants and the strong women and accidentally seeing equality.
Yes.
Oops.
The anti-suffragists who go to the Barnum and Bailey Circus at Madison Square Garden and see Sandwina, the German strongwoman, lift her husband and 2-year-old son with one arm, tremble for the future of the anti-cause. When all women are able to rule their homes by such simple and primitive methods, they will get the vote. Or take it.
That's fabulous. Wonderful.
She's visually and vocally proving that women are not what you say they are, and that you cannot keep making these arguments that you've been trying to make.
I love that. It reminds me of Bubulina. I love those examples of women who, they don't scream about the thing. They just be the example. And just by existing.
By doing it, you prove it can be done.
I love that.
And she's doing pretty well for herself and her family. She is earning, at her high point, $1,500 a week.
Back then?
Back then. That is $50,000 a week.
Hey,
that is $2.5 million a year-ish today, just with her own physical strength.
I love it.
Tell that woman that she isn't the boss of her own life.
A condition, not a theory, confronts us. The new woman is no longer threatening. She is here.
One of the reasons I wanted to include Sandwina, for one, it made sense because she is one of the strongest women in the world. And in a book about physical strength, you have to include Sandwina. But I wanted to make a larger point that physical strength is not just about how much you can pick up or if you can bend an iron bar. It's about how it ties into strength of all kinds. And that includes mental strength, emotional strength, spiritual strength. And it includes types of power. And one of those powers is political power. I think that Sandwina and her circus comrades are a great example of how if you have physical power, you can have other forms of power as well. And we don't always make that connection. We often see physical strength as something that's kind of optional or maybe even frivolous. Someone, especially a mother who takes time to work out, is kind of selfish, caring more about herself and her body than the things that really matter, especially during this time period. But that's not true. Having that physical power allowed them to go and fight for things that matter to them, and it put them in a better position to do so.
There's a story about an encounter that Katie once had with an unnamed strongman who was not in total sympathy with the suffragist movement, let's say. And he was in the audience at one of her shows and would not stop taunting her about this suffragist nonsense. And soon found himself raised high up in the air and then thrown into a crowd of his friends who were knocked down like bowling pins.
Come on. Everybody dreams of being able to do that.
Where is this movie?
Yeah.
Sandwina had zero tolerance for misogyny nonsense.
Yeah.
And neither did Max. Her marriage was one of absolute equality and respect and mutual admiration. And she would tolerate nothing less. Max is that rare bird, the actually fully supportive, non-threatened team wife man who is all in on his wife's career and success and fame. And is perfectly contented, thrilled to be by her side behind the scenes or being thrown around on stage like a rubber doll every single step of the way.
And I'm sure that act, like thinking about acrobatics, like Cirque du Soleil, it takes both people. So he had to have been actively making himself liftable and throwable.
Sure, yeah.
It's him and her. Yeah. Oh, I love him. I love you, Max.
He's wonderful. I adore him. And I think you and I both know this firsthand, that having an actually fully supportive, fully engaged partner is so important if you want to accomplish anything.
You called Max a rare bird, but I don't think it's rare anymore. Times have changed, maybe thanks to the Maxes and great Sandwinas of the world.
I hope so.
And I think that born into a circus family was a little bit different. I think if you grow up in the circus and you're seeing these amazing feats that people are performing, that you would be more apt to have an admiration for that than to have scorn for it. So it probably wasn't as unusual for Max to see a woman who was strong.
He's not growing up in patriarchy. He's growing up in the upside down. He's growing up in the mirror, right?
Yeah.
She stayed strong throughout her life. So even into her 50s and 60s, she was still very strong. She did modify her acts. She stopped doing as many overhead things, and she started doing more tricks where she would bend iron bars and break chains. So she found a way to evolve her act over time so that she could continue performing at a high level, but doing things that made more sense probably on her joints and that kind of thing as she aged. She started calling herself the Queen of Iron, and that was kind of a jab at Sigmund Breitbart, who was the King of Iron. He was a fellow strongman performer, and they had quite a rivalry going.
Zisha Breitbart, as he was known, was from a family of blacksmiths. And so he kind of makes that his shtick. He's often wearing a blacksmith's leather apron.
Brilliant.
Often not much else in his act, and he is bending metal and breaking horseshoes and biting through iron chains. He once apparently carried a baby elephant up a ladder.
Okay. Just as you do.
Pretty amazing guy.
One night we were both in the theater watching the great Sigmund Breitbart, who called himself the world's strongest human. He learned that we were present and, sneering, called up to our box. "Come down here, Miss Sandwina. Let us see if you are as good as your husband has been telling us." Katie promptly leapt down from the stage, just in time to catch a heavy chain that Breitbart had thrown at her. "Here, Katie," he said mockingly. "Try to break this. It will be good training for you." I held my breath as the spotlight picked up Katie studying the chain. Then she carefully took off her gloves, wound the chain around her fingers, and broke it with one quick motion. Tossing the pieces back to the strong man, whose jaw now hung slack, she said in a voice loud enough to be heard in the last balcony, "Thank you for the lesson, Breitbart. I think it is over."
For a while, he was following her around and challenging her every show. He would sit in her audience and heckle her and challenge her to do feats that he believed only he could do.
Fabulous.
And she matched him every time.
Yes.
So eventually the name changed the Queen of Iron, because it's a nod to, I have also now defeated Sigmund Breitbart.
Awesome.
There was even a rumor that he would refuse to appear in a city at the same time as Sandwina. They all had a friendly rivalry kind of going on. I think there was no real animosity there. All of the men who were performing at that time did, in general, think Sandwina was amazing. Of course, you don't want to be upstaged by anyone, especially a woman. Unfortunately, in that time, you wouldn't want to be, but I think that there was a lot of healthy respect in that circle because they all know how much work they're putting in.
When Sandwina finally retired after 40 years on the road,
Amazing.
she and Max opened a tavern in Queens.
What? Nah.
Max was the cook, and Sandwina manned the bar.
Oh my gosh.
She was also the bouncer.
What?
If there was someone that needed to be thrown out, she'd say, "Hey, honey, can you open the door?" He'd open the door for her. She'd pick up the guy, and she'd toss him out.
Come on. I want to go there.
And she would do sort of smaller scale feats of strength just during the course of the evening to entertain customers.
Oh, for a time machine.
But over the years, she has been largely forgotten outside of bodybuilding circles.
Yeah.
I think she is only known by people who are pretty into the strength training community, but that's changing a bit. Now I think more people are becoming aware of her.
Especially, I think, social media.
Mm-hmm.
I think mostly because the pictures of her are amazing and they instantly suck you in. When you see a woman holding her husband and her child, you need to know more.
What an icon.
They do give a Katie Sandwina statue to the winner of the Arnold Strongwoman competition. It's a really lovely statue. I got a chance to see it. And she's the perfect embodiment of someone to be on that statue because she really was the prototypical strong woman who made a huge impact on the field.
Huge thanks to our guest, Haley Shapley. Visit our website at what'shernamepodcast.com, where you can find photos, links, resources, and more. Voiceovers for this episode also provided by Anica Bell, Mark Henderson, Marion Lamm, and Matthew Meikle. Music for this episode was provided by Jeremy Korpas, the United States Marine Band, the Marine Clarinet Choir, Quincas Moreira, Asher Fulero, and Amanda Setlik Wilson.
Our theme song was composed and performed by Daniel Foster Smith.
Our intern is Katie Boucher.
What's Her Name is produced by Olivia Meikle and Katie Nelson, and this episode was edited by Olivia Meikle.